I began by declaring an interest that I am the co-chair of the APPG on Srebrenica. But my interest in this part of the world arose from the fact that from 2000 to 2002, I worked for the United Nations mission in Kosovo after the NATO bombing of the former Yugoslavia. And Kosovo was an autonomous province of the state of Serbia. And prior to 2000, the Serbians had come into Kosovo, and I saw from first hand some of the atrocities that had been carried out by the Serbian government in Kosovo. When I therefore came into Parliament in 2010, and I got interested in the issue of Srebrenica in particular, that I then found this with another Conservative member as well. The name Srebrenica is associated to those dark days in July 1995, where thousands of men and boys were systematically murdered and buried in mass graves. The victims, who were Muslims, were selected for death based on their identity. Many of us remember the images of the war in Bosnia during the 1990s, watching the horror of the footage of Sarajevo under siege, people being held in concentration camps, and slowly learning about the reports of atrocities being committed across Bosnia, which culminated in genocide. The APPG was set up in 2013 with the purpose of commemorating those particular horrors and reminding us. Because until July of 2 years ago, when because of the pandemic we stopped doing this, we had a book to commemorate the signing of the remembrance in this house. Because we say at every conflict, never again, and then years later, we have another conflict. Yep. Yep. When the Dayton Agreement was signed, it was not perfect, but it did stop the bloodshed for a number of years. And therefore, it's important for all of us to ensure that peace continues. We can't return to the violence and destruction of the 1990s. And therefore, it's important that the United Kingdom, with our European partners and others in the world, should start working together on these to ensure that this does not happen again. The seeds of genocide in Srebrenica were planted after years of growing Serb nationalism and the spread of fear and hatred. And even now, there is a genocidal denial by Serbian leaders, and they are trying to stoke the same fears again. Recently, Belana Palsovic, former president of the Republic of Serbia and a convicted war criminal, explaining their dehumanizing ideology and thinking, and he said, it was genetically deformed material that embraced Islam, and now, of course, with each successive generation, it simply becomes concentrated. It gets worse and worse. It simply expresses itself and dictates that their style of thinking, which is rooted in their genes, and through the centuries, the genes are degraded further. I hope the Minister will agree with me that this is inflammatory language which should be condemned by all. Given the history of the atrocities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I hope that the government will take steps to activate the conflict centre and adopt an atrocity prevention framework so that we don't descend into any more identity-based violence. We also know that the current Serbian leader, Dodik, has pledged to withdraw from the federal institution and form distinct entities seriously threatening the stability of the nation and heralding the fears of a return to violence. If the international community allows this secession to take place, then they would be rewarding the Bosnian Serb with their goal of creating Greater Serbia by handing to them the very territory which they committed a 4-year campaign of consisting forced deportation, torture and mass murder. This would also risk of the most vulnerable returnees who are based in places like Srebrenica and Prejudo. These survivors already have experienced suffering at the hands of the Bosnian Serb force, and many of their loved ones killed. Now there's a real danger that they're in conflict again and would happen to them. The potential for return to conflict on our doorstep is worrying. Therefore, can I ask the Minister if her and her department will ensure that they share their analysis of the current crisis across all of the government departments, including the levelling up housing and communities, because the members of the Bosnian British community are reliving their traumas and for what an escalation of violence might mean for their loved ones in the Balkans. Can I ask the government to proactively reach out and work with the Bosnian communities here so that they feel that there is someone looking after them and they won't be left alone that they were years ago? And also ask if they would work with the Remembering Srebrenica led by Bakar Azmi and his team so that we are reminded of what can happen if we do nothing. And I end by saying, we know the First World War was started by a Serb nationalist who actually killed the king in Sarajevo. And I don't really want to see history repeating itself. Yeah.
James Sunderland.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I was a young captain in 1997 when I deployed on my very first tour to Bosnia. It was an amazing experience.